If you walk through the city of London today, you will see towers of glass and steel housing the world's financial powerhouses. You will see the Bank of England, guardian of the pound sterling, standing proud on Threadneedle Street. You will see monuments to Nelson, Wellington, and Churchill celebrating military victories that supposedly made Britain the world's dominant power. But what you will not see is the economic empire those victories were meant to protect. Between 1815 and 1945, Britain won every major war it fought. It defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, crushed the Kaiser in the trenches of France, and stood alone against Hitler when all of Europe had fallen. The Union Jack flew over a quarter of the world's surface. British ships controlled the seas. British banks financed global trade. British industry powered the first industrial revolution. The empire upon which the sun never set appeared unshakable, eternal, destined to dominate the 20th century as it had dominated the 19th. They believed military victory guaranteed economic supremacy. They assumed that winning wars would preserve their wealth and power. They did not realize that the very act of winning those wars would bankrupt the nation and transfer economic control to their supposed allies. They forgot that wars are not won on battlefields alone, but in treasuries, factories, and balance sheets. The British Empire won every battle but lost the economic war. This is the story of how Britain quietly lost its economy after winning every war. It destroyed itself not through military defeat, not through revolution or invasion, but through the accumulated cost of victory itself. This is the most expensive triumph in history. It is the ultimate lesson in Pyrrhic victory, proof that you can win every war and still lose everything that matters. The British discovered that in the modern age, the nation that finances the war controls the peace, and the creditor always outlasts the warrior. By 1945, Britain had saved the world from tyranny, but the price was its own economic sovereignty, paid in full to the rising empire across the Atlantic. Understand how Britain lost its economic empire, we must return to 1815, to the moment of its greatest triumph. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated at Waterloo. The French threat that had consumed British resources for 22 years had finally been eliminated. Britain emerged as the undisputed superpower of the 19th century, controlling the seas through the Royal Navy, dominating global trade through the City of London, and industrializing faster than any nation on Earth. The economic engine that powered this dominance was unprecedented in human history. British factories produced more than half the world's iron, coal, and cotton textiles. British merchants controlled 60% of global shipping. British banks financed railways in Argentina, mines in Australia, plantations in India, and governments across Europe. The pound sterling was not merely a currency, but the foundation of international commerce, backed by gold reserves that dwarfed those of any rival. London was the undisputed financial capital of the world, a position it had held since the defeat of Amsterdam in the 17th century. But beneath this surface of industrial and financial supremacy lay a dangerous assumption. British policymakers believed their economic dominance was natural, permanent, and self-sustaining. They assumed Britain would remain the workshop of the world forever. They did not realize they were living through a unique historical moment that would never return. The head start Britain gained from being first to industrialize created temporary advantages that British leaders mistook for permanent superiority. They built an economic strategy around maintaining global commitments that required perpetual industrial leadership, access to cheap raw materials, and control of sea lanes. The entire system depended on Britain remaining more productive, more innovative, and more efficient than every competitor simultaneously. The character who would guide Britain through its first test was William Ewart Gladstone, who served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister during the Victorian era. Gladstone was born in Liverpool in 1809 to a wealthy merchant family enriched by West Indian sugar and slavery. He entered Parliament at 22 and spent 63 years in British politics, becoming the embodiment of Victorian financial orthodoxy. Gladstone believed in balanced budgets, minimal government debt, and the gold standard with religious fervor. His speeches on fiscal responsibility could last 4 hours. His budgets were read like scripture by financiers across Europe. Gladstone realized that Britain's economic power rested on a foundation of trust. The pound sterling commanded global respect because Britain always paid its debts, maintained convertibility to gold, and ran its finances with prudence that bordered on obsession. He understood that Britain's advantage was not merely its factories and ships, but its reputation as the most creditworthy nation on earth. This was not simply good policy. It was the strategic insight that would dominate British economic thinking for the next century, even as the world changed around them in ways Gladstone could never have imagined. The system that emerged from this Victorian confidence was elegant in theory, but brittle in practice. Britain imported food and raw materials from its empire and other nations, paid for with manufactured goods exported worldwide. The City of London financed this global trade through short-term credits and long-term investments. Profits from overseas investments supplemented trade earnings. The Royal Navy protected the sea lanes. The entire arrangement generated wealth that seemed limitless, but it contained a fatal vulnerability. Britain had become dependent on international trade for survival. The nation that had once fed itself from its own soil now imported 40% of its food. The workshop of the world had specialized so completely in manufacturing that it could not feed its own population without constant access to global markets. This dependency would have mattered little in a peaceful world, but peace would not last. The first compromise came in 1914, when the guns of August shattered the Victorian peace that Gladstone's generation had taken for granted. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered alliance systems that pulled Britain into a European war for the first time since Napoleon. Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith and Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George faced an immediate crisis. The British Army was small, designed for colonial policing rather than continental warfare. France was Britain's ally. Germany was advancing. Britain had no choice but to fight, but it had no army capable of fighting. The fateful decision came within weeks. In August 1914, Britain committed to raising a mass army through voluntary enlistment, eventually introducing conscription in 1916. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, called for millions of volunteers to create a new army that could match German military power. The recruitment posters promised glory and adventure. The reality was industrial slaughter on a scale never seen before. But raising armies was the cheap part. Equipping them, feeding them, transporting them, and keeping them supplied with shells, bullets, uniforms, and medical care required economic mobilization that dwarfed anything in British history. Britain had discovered a magic trick. The City of London could borrow money faster than British factories could produce goods. With simple loans arranged in New York and Paris, the British government could equip armies, build ships, and purchase American steel, wheat, and oil. The war was expected to be over by Christmas 1914. It lasted 4 years. The borrowing that was meant to bridge a temporary emergency became a permanent addiction. By 1915, Britain was spending 25% of its gross domestic product on the war. By 1916, that figure reached 50%. By 1917, it exceeded 60%. Think about that figure. More than half of everything Britain produced was consumed by the war effort. The spending spree that followed was both necessary and catastrophic. Britain purchased grain from Canada, beef from Argentina, steel from the United States, and oil from Mexico. It built factories to produce shells at rates that consumed Britain's entire pre-war copper output in months. It expanded shipyards to replace merchant vessels sunk by German U-boats. It paid separation allowances to soldiers' families, pensions to widows, and disability payments to the maimed. Every soldier at the front required the labor of 10 workers at home to keep him fed, armed, and supplied. The costs escalated beyond anything imagined in 1914. By 1917, the British war economy had turned into a Ponzi scheme. The government was borrowing money to pay interest on previous loans. They were digging a hole to fill a hole. Chancellor of the Exchequer Bonar Law issued war bonds to the British public, but domestic savings could not finance spending on this scale. Britain turned to the United States, where J.P. Morgan arranged loans that financed British and French war purchases from American suppliers. The arrangement seemed brilliant. American money bought American goods shipped on American vessels to British and French armies fighting Germany. Everyone benefited except the British Treasury. The escalating statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1914, Britain's national debt stood at £650 million, accumulated over centuries of empire building. By 1918, it had risen to £7.4 billion. Think about that figure. Britain had increased its debt by more than 11 times in just 4 years. The interest payments alone consumed 20% of government revenue. That meant 1 out of every £5 collected in taxes went to pay creditors in New York and London, money that could not be spent on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or anything else that builds prosperity. The human impact of this debt trap becomes clear when we zoom from the macro to the individual. a Birmingham factory worker who earned £2 per week paid taxes that increasingly went not to services for his family, but to interest payments on war debt. A Yorkshire coal miner watched his village school close, while bond payments to American and British creditors continued without interruption. The working class that had volunteered in millions to fight for king and country returned home to find their government broke, their jobs uncertain, and their sacrifices rewarded with austerity. The warning signs appeared immediately after the armistice in November 1918. Britain emerged victorious, but the United States emerged rich. During the war years, America had transformed from a debtor nation borrowing from London to a creditor nation lending to everyone else. American industrial production had doubled. American gold reserves had tripled. American banks had replaced British banks as the financiers of global trade. The center of economic gravity had shifted across the Atlantic, but British leaders refused to acknowledge what had happened. They acted as if Britain remained the financial capital of the world, a delusion that would cost them dearly. The desperate measures began in the 1920s. Britain returned the pound to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity, a decision driven by national pride rather than economic reality. Winston Churchill, then serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, wanted to prove Britain remained a great power capable of maintaining the strongest currency on earth. The policy was presented as a return to normalcy and sound finance, but in reality, it was an act of economic self-mutilation. The overvalued pound made British exports expensive and foreign imports cheap. British factories could not compete. Unemployment soared. The coal miners struck in 1926, followed by a general strike that paralyzed the nation. The poisoned terms of British war debt revealed themselves with perfect clarity in this moment. Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion from wartime loans, an astronomical sum that had to be repaid in gold or dollars regardless of British economic conditions. At the same time, Britain was owed money by France, Russia, and other allies who had borrowed from London during the war. The difference was simple. The United States insisted on repayment. The British debtors could not pay. Britain found itself trapped between American creditors demanding gold and European debtors offering apologies. The British government tried to collect from Europe to pay America. Europe could not pay. America would not forgive. The trap closed tighter every year. The tipping point arrived in September 1931. The Great Depression that had begun with the Wall Street crash in 1929 finally reached Britain with full force. At the exact same time, a financial crisis erupted in Central Europe as the Austrian Creditanstalt Bank collapsed, triggering panic across the continent. Foreign investors who had kept deposits in London began withdrawing gold, draining the Bank of England's reserves. The pound sterling, that symbol of British financial supremacy for 2 centuries, came under speculative attack. The income from global trade collapsed, but the obligation to service American war debt remained fixed. In September 1931, Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, looked at the ledgers and realized the game was up. The gold reserves were hemorrhaging. Foreign depositors were demanding conversion of pounds to gold at rates that would exhaust British reserves within weeks. The Bank of England faced a choice. It could raise interest rates to usury levels, crushing British industry and throwing millions out of work, or it could abandon the gold standard that had defined British monetary policy since Isaac Newton ran the mint in 1717. On September 20, 1931, the British government issued a statement suspending gold convertibility. In polite language, this was described as a temporary measure to stabilize financial markets. In brutal language, Britain had defaulted on its promise to exchange pounds for gold on demand. The decision that Gladstone would have considered unthinkable, that Victorian financiers would have viewed as national dishonor, had been forced upon Britain by the accumulated costs of victory in the Great War. The pound sterling immediately lost 25% of its value against the dollar. British prestige suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. The immediate reaction was global financial chaos. 25 countries abandoned the gold standard within months, following Britain into monetary uncertainty. The rigid system of fixed exchange rates that had facilitated global trade for generations collapsed. International commerce contracted further. The depression deepened. But Britain had a different problem than other nations. British leaders understood that abandoning gold meant abandoning any pretense that London remained the financial center of the world. That title now belonged unambiguously to New York, where the Federal Reserve held gold reserves larger than those of Britain, France, and Germany combined. But this crisis merely set the stage for a larger catastrophe. In September 1939, 8 years after Britain abandoned the gold standard, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their guarantees to Polish independence. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had spent years trying to avoid another war through appeasement, now faced the nightmare scenario he had worked desperately to prevent. Britain would have to fight another total war against Germany, but this time Britain was already weakened by debt, diminished by depression, and facing an enemy stronger and more prepared than the Kaiser had ever been. The moment of truth came in May 1940. Germany invaded France, bypassing the Maginot Line through Belgium and the Netherlands using tactics that rendered French and British defensive strategies obsolete. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind its heavy equipment. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, which now controlled Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, told Parliament that Britain would never surrender. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. What he did not say, what could not be said publicly, was that Britain could not win this war without massive American support, and that support would come with conditions that would strip Britain of its remaining economic independence. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Britain needed American aircraft, tanks, trucks, ships, steel, oil, and food to survive. American neutrality laws required cash payment. By December 1940, Britain had spent nearly all its gold reserves and dollar holdings purchasing American supplies. Churchill sent a desperate letter to President Franklin Roosevelt explaining that Britain had reached the end of its financial resources. Britain could fight or it could pay, but it could not do both. Roosevelt's solution was Lend-Lease, a program that allowed Britain to receive American supplies on credit, with payment deferred until after the war. The program was presented as an act of American generosity to defend democracy. In reality, it was the mechanism through which the United States would acquire British assets, bases, and economic influence at bargain prices. The takeover did not arrive with tanks and troops. It arrived in August 1941, when Churchill sailed across the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt aboard warships anchored in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. Churchill came seeking a formal alliance and American entry into the war. Roosevelt came with terms. The Atlantic Charter that emerged from this meeting outlined Allied war aims including self-determination for all peoples, a barely disguised demand that Britain begin dismantling its empire after the war. But the economic terms negotiated alongside the Charter were far more consequential. The Americans had a different idea about how to structure the post-war world. They did not want to conquer Britain militarily. They had a much smarter approach. American negotiators led by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and State Department officials demanded that Britain accept Article 7 of the Mutual Aid Agreement, which committed Britain to eliminating imperial preference, the system of tariffs that gave British and Commonwealth goods favorable treatment within the empire. The Americans were not soldiers in uniform. They were financial professionals and diplomats. They carried briefcases, not swords, but what they negotiated in those meetings would accomplish what no enemy army had ever achieved: the dissolution of British economic control over its own empire. The extraction system that emerged worked with elegant simplicity. Lend-Lease deliveries flowed to Britain throughout the war, but they came with strings attached. Britain had to open its books to American auditors who scrutinized every expenditure. Britain had to liquidate its investments in American companies to raise cash before receiving Lend-Lease aid. Britain had to agree to abandon imperial preference after the war. Britain had to accept that the dollar, not the pound, would be the currency of international trade in the post-war order. The Americans demanded detailed inventories of British gold reserves, dollar holdings, and overseas investments, information Britain had never shared with any foreign power. The specific extractions tell the story. In 1940 and 1941, Britain sold Courtaulds' American subsidiary, British-owned utilities in South America, and the American Viscose Corporation to raise dollars. These were not distressed sales. These were forced liquidations of profitable assets at prices favorable to American buyers. The British government paid for the privilege of defending civilization by selling the family silver to American investors who understood they were buying at generational discounts. If a British investor owned shares in an American company, those shares were requisitioned by the government and sold to raise cash for war supplies. The profit went to the Treasury to buy ammunition, but the assets were gone forever. Between 1940 and 1945, Britain liquidated approximately £1.1 billion worth of overseas investments, roughly one-quarter of all British foreign assets. This meant Britain's ability to earn income from global investments, the invisible earnings that had supplemented trade for generations, was permanently reduced. The Britain that emerged from the war could no longer live beyond its means by collecting dividends from railways in Argentina and mines in South Africa. Those assets had been sold to finance victory. The economic model that had sustained British living standards since the Victorian era was broken beyond repair. The sovereignty death happened gradually, then suddenly. During the war, Britain became dependent on American supplies for survival. After the war, Britain discovered that dependence had become permanent. In August 1945, Japan surrendered and World War II ended. President Harry Truman immediately terminated Lend-Lease, cutting off American supplies without warning. Britain was left with a decimated economy, exhausted population, massive war debts, and no ability to finance imports. The new Labour government led by Clement Attlee sent John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, to Washington to negotiate a grant or interest-free loan to help Britain recover. Keynes argued that Britain had fought for 2 years while America remained neutral, that British sacrifices had saved Western civilization, that generosity was owed. The Americans disagreed. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest, with repayment beginning in 1951. The terms included immediate convertibility of the pound sterling and the final abolition of imperial preference. Keynes called the terms harsh and humiliating. The British government accepted them anyway because the alternative was starvation and economic collapse. Britain, the victor in the war, the nation that had stood alone against Hitler, had become a supplicant borrowing from its former colony on terms dictated by American negotiators who understood perfectly well that Britain had no alternative. The final arrangements imposed on Britain destroyed any remaining pretense of economic equality with the United States. The Bretton Woods system created in 1944 established the dollar, not the pound, as the currency of international trade. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were headquartered in Washington, not London. American officials dominated both institutions. The post-war economic architecture was designed by Americans to serve American interests, and Britain's role was to accept the new order and adapt. The British reigned over a declining empire, but the Americans ruled the global economy. The visible symbol of this transfer appeared in the changing landscape of global finance. In 1914, London had been the undisputed center of international banking. By 1950, New York had replaced it. American banks financed global trade. American dollars lubricated international commerce. American corporations invested overseas while British companies retrenched. The physical transformation was evident in Manhattan, where glass and steel skyscrapers rose higher than anything in London, housing banks and corporations that controlled more capital than the entire British Empire. The final payment on the 1945 loan was made on December 29, 2006. It took exactly 61 years to pay off the cost of victory in World War II. 61 years after the war ended, 61 years after British and American soldiers celebrated together in the ruins of Berlin, British taxpayers were still sending checks to the American and Canadian governments to service debt incurred defending Western civilization from fascism. The interest payments alone had exceeded the original principal. Britain had paid for the privilege of surviving. The story of British economic decline is the ultimate lesson in the hidden costs of military victory. The British believed they could fight 2 world wars, maintain a global empire, and preserve their economic supremacy simultaneously. They did not realize that the very act of winning those wars would transfer economic power to the nation that financed them. The Americans proved that the most effective way to supplant an empire is not to invade it militarily, but to become its creditor, then wait for crisis to extract concessions that no conqueror could have demanded at gunpoint. The long shadow of this transformation extends to the present day. Britain never really came back as an economic superpower. The empire was dismantled between 1947 and 1970 as colonies gained independence, often leaving Britain with liabilities but few assets. The pound sterling, once the currency of global commerce, became a secondary reserve currency used primarily within the Commonwealth. British industry, which had pioneered the Industrial Revolution, declined steadily as American, German, and Japanese competitors proved more efficient. The financial services industry that emerged in London during the 1980s was impressive, but it operated in a world where New York and Washington set the rules. But Britain teaches us a broader lesson about the nature of power in the modern world. The British made a fundamental error. They assumed military power and economic power were the same thing. They believed that winning battles guaranteed prosperity. They did not understand that wars consume wealth regardless of who wins them, and that the nation which preserves its economic strength during conflicts will dominate the peace that follows. The Americans understood this perfectly. They entered both world wars late after the other powers had exhausted themselves. They emerged from both wars with their industrial base expanded, their financial system strengthened, and their geopolitical position improved. This was not an accident, it was strategy. The universal truth embedded in British decline applies to any nation that confuses military success with comprehensive power. When a country spends decades fighting expensive wars, even victorious wars, it depletes the economic resources that sustain long-term prosperity. Remember that Britain won every war between 1815 and 1945, yet ended that period economically subordinate to the United States. Remember that military victory is meaningless if it bankrupts the victor. Remember that in the long run, creditors outlast warriors, bankers outlast generals, and the nation that controls capital controls everything that matters. The monuments to Nelson and Wellington still stand in London. They commemorate victories that were real and important, but they also stand as reminders that winning wars and winning the future are not the same thing. Britain saved the world from Napoleon and Hitler. The price was its empire, its economic independence, and its position at the center of global affairs. If you walk through the city of London today and look closely, you will see the headquarters of American investment banks occupying the prime real estate where British merchant banks once ruled global finance. It is the ultimate symbol of the transformation that followed 2 world wars and the debt that financed them. The British won the wars but lost the peace. They defeated military tyranny but surrendered to economic reality. History does not repeat itself, but it echoes in patterns that patient observers can recognize. If you understand how economic power shifts beneath the surface of military conflict, you gain insight into how the world actually works. If you ignore the lessons Britain learned through painful experience, you are destined to repeat them. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.